On the ground, the HOA tyrant yelled, his black firearm aimed directly at my daughter's head for the simple act of violating a parking rule. In the next instant, however, his aggressive expression morphed into one of pure terror. The bullet remained in the chamber, but the Glock was no longer in his possession. My daughter, having disarmed him with a lightning-fast maneuver, stated coolly, I've trained Navy SEALs to eliminate targets in 37 distinct ways. Does improper parking constitute the 38th? The entire neighborhood was paralyzed. 3 minutes later, actual police officers showed up, and an 8-year reign of control started to collapse. All because this wannabe officer had targeted the wrong person. The expression on his face upon realizing his mistake is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It marked the start of a conflict that would change not only our community, but potentially homeowners associations all over America. We have received messages from people in all 50 states who have faced comparable situations. And I can assure you, the events in our neighborhood could unfold anywhere. It had been 6 months since my daughter Marigold's last visit. Sunny Pines was typically a serene place, yet the HOA maintained a vigilant watch over every detail. I'm Jetstorm, a retired aerospace engineer from NASA, and my wife and I had resided in this affluent neighborhood for 15 years. We had complied with every absurd regulation they imposed on us, from the required desert beige mailboxes to the strictly controlled height of our lawn, not to exceed 2 inches and measured on a weekly basis, and even limitations on the types of flowers permitted in our front yard. Only drought-resistant, aesthetically consistent varieties sanctioned by the landscaping committee were allowed. Marigold arrived around noon in her customized military jeep. I could perceive the weariness on her face even through the window. She had just finished a 72-hour continuous training exercise with her SEAL recruits and had then driven for 3 hours straight to come see us. At 36, Marigold possessed 12 years of military service, with a specialization in instructing Navy SEALs on tactical operations and survival psychology under conditions of extreme stress. To say she was tough would be an understatement, but on that day, she appeared on the verge of collapse. Her typically sharp hazel eyes were red with fatigue, and her athletic build moved with the careful precision of someone resisting utter exhaustion. "Dad, can I get some help with these boxes?" she yelled from the driveway. "I've brought some gear for the house for you too." Marigold had parked in a visitor space close to our house. It was technically designated for only 30-minute use, but she had multiple heavy boxes to carry in, one of which was a specialized security system she intended to install for us following a recent spate of burglaries in an adjacent community. We were in the middle of carrying in the last of the gear when her phone vibrated. Marigold glanced at the caller ID, and her demeanor shifted instantly. "I have to get this," she stated with a look of concern. "It concerns one of my trainees who is experiencing a severe PTSD episode. He was part of an especially difficult operation last year, and the anniversary is acting as a trigger." The conversation went on for nearly 25 minutes, during which Marigold sat on our sofa, using the serene, authoritative tone she employs in crisis moments. I could overhear her guiding the young man through breathing techniques, reminding him of his training, and arranging for on-base personnel to give him immediate assistance. I knew this was a grave matter. She was calming someone down from a perilous mental state, applying specialized methods she had designed for elite operators dealing with combat trauma. By the time she ended the call, the Jeep was forgotten, and Marigold seemed even more depleted than before. "My apologies for that," she sighed, massaging her temples. "These kids sometimes bear more than they can manage. We test their physical limits, but the psychological struggles are the most difficult to prepare them for. He's going to be fine now. My colleague is with him, and a crisis team is on standby." Ravina brought Marigold a glass of water and some ibuprofen, which she accepted with gratitude. "You need to have something to eat," my wife urged, already heading to the kitchen to warm up the lunch we had made. Marigold gave a slight nod, shutting her eyes for a moment. I could perceive the burden of responsibility she felt for her trainees, these young men and women whose survival might one day hinge on the abilities and mental strength she was helping them build. We were just getting seated for lunch when the doorbell chimed. It wasn't a typical ring, but a forceful, repetitive banging that caused the doorframe to vibrate. "Who on earth is that?" I grumbled as I got up from my chair. "It sounds like an FBI raid on a drug house." When I opened the door, Nero Wilder was standing there, our neighborhood's self-styled security head, dressed in what resembled a police uniform but with an HOA patch carelessly stitched onto the sleeve. At 58, Wilder, a self-declared fitness guru, was on the verge of igniting a conflict that would ultimately force one of them out of our community permanently. "Your daughter must move that military monstrosity now," Wilder snapped without any form of greeting. "It has been in the visitor's spot for 43 minutes. That is 13 minutes beyond the limit." He held a clipboard in one hand and was already filling out what I guessed was a violation form. His pen pressed so forcefully onto the paper that I thought it might rip through. I could see a glint of satisfaction behind his mirrored sunglasses. Wilder thrived on these situations. He had worked as a security guard at the nearby mall before being let go for using excessive force on a teenage shoplifter. He had since discovered the ideal avenue for his desire to dominate others within our HOA's convoluted rulebook. Before I could say anything, Marigold was at my side, drying her hands on a dish towel. I could see she had gathered herself, her military composure instinctively taking over in the presence of a confrontation, despite her fatigue. "I apologize for that, sir," she said with courtesy, her tone neutral yet respectful, the same one she likely used with challenging superior officers. "I've just come from a marathon training session and a long drive. I had to unload heavy equipment for my parents and then got held up on an emergency call with a trainee. I will move it in 15 minutes, as soon as I've had a bite to eat." Wilder's expression became rigid, the lines around his mouth tightening into a scowl. In the 8 years following his appointment to the HOA Security Committee by Nancy Weber, the HOA president, he had developed a reputation for an inflexibility that verged on sadistic. Local children were frightened of him. Elderly neighbors would physically change direction to avoid him. The regulations clearly state a 30-minute maximum. "I've already dispatched a tow truck. That will be a $300 towing fee plus a $500 fine for the violation of Section 4.3 of the HOA regulations." He appeared to be reciting these figures from memory as if he had practiced them. I observed how his chest seemed to swell slightly as he spoke of the regulations, as if their mere existence somehow enhanced his own stature. Marigold's expression stayed composed, but I saw the slight narrowing of her eyes, a look she would get as an adolescent when pushed too far. It was a subtle change, but I knew my daughter well enough to recognize the gears turning behind her calm facade. "Mr. Wilder, I realize there are regulations, but surely some reasonable accommodation can be made. I have been assisting my elderly parents with heavy items after a 3-hour drive on no sleep. I just require 15 minutes to eat before I move it." I could tell Marigold was intentionally adopting a softer approach, even employing the term elderly parents to appeal to a sense of decency that, in hindsight, Wilder obviously lacked. Instead of acknowledging this fair request, Wilder took out his phone and began to film Marigold, holding it just inches from her face in a blatant effort to elicit a reaction. "I am documenting your failure to adhere to HOA regulations. This will lead to further fines." His voice adopted a formal tone that would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "I possess the authority to maintain compliance in this community. Do you have any idea how many troublemakers I've had to handle? People like you believe the rules don't pertain to them." Marigold let out a deep sigh, and I could see her consciously opting to de-escalate despite Wilder's goading. "I am not refusing to comply. I am asking for a reasonable accommodation because of extenuating circumstances. I will move the vehicle in a moment." She started to turn back inside, evidently attempting to stop the confrontation from escalating. That was the moment it occurred. Wilder extended his hand and seized her arm, his fingers pressing into her bicep. "You don't turn your back when I'm speaking to you." His voice had escalated to a yell, and I noticed my neighbor from across the street peeking from their window at the disturbance. What followed unfolded in an instant. Despite her exhaustion, 12 years of military conditioning took over. With military precision, Marigold swiftly neutralized the threat, sending Wilder stumbling backward into Ravena's rose bushes. The expression on his face as he picked himself up was a blend of astonishment, shame, and fury. His carefully built image of authority had been demolished in mere seconds, and worse, there were onlookers. His sunglasses had tumbled off, showing small, watery eyes that were bulging with rage. "You just attacked a security officer," he shrieked, his face becoming a concerning shade of red as thorns from the rose bush clung to his uniform. "I'm returning with actual police." As he marched away, dropping citation slips behind him, I looked at Marigold, who seemed somewhat taken aback by her own instinctive response. "I didn't intend to do that," she said softly. "It was pure muscle memory." "When someone grabs you like that," she paused, shaking her head, We had no idea at that moment that 20 minutes later, the gun Wilder kept concealed under his jacket would be drawn and aimed directly at my daughter. And in that moment, she would be left with no option but to employ every skill the military had taught her. Margold had just finished recounting what took place when we heard the sound of car doors shutting outside. "He's returned," I stated, looking out through the curtains. Wilder was striding up our driveway with the resolute gait of a person about to do something profoundly foolish. This time, however, he was not by himself. He had brought along two other HOA members, Carl Johnson, a timid former accountant in his 60s who consistently followed Wilder out of apprehension that his own property would become a target. Wilder had once had Carl's classic car towed for being unsightly, and Zania Ramirez, a 40-year-old child psychologist who had just moved into the area and had yet to grasp the existing power dynamics. Judging by the perplexed expression on Zania's face, I surmised Wilder had concocted a story about dangerous intruders to persuade her to join him. She repeatedly glanced uneasily between Wilder and our home. Margold had taken a few moments to regain her composure, utilizing the breathing exercises she instructs her SEAL trainees to use in high-pressure scenarios. While still physically drained, her mind was now sharp and ready for trouble. I observed her subtly placing herself between us and the entrance, a protective posture so deeply ingrained she likely wasn't even aware she was doing it. "Let me take care of this," she said serenely, her voice shifting into what I knew as her instructor tone. "I've managed worse situations in much more hazardous locations. Just stand back and allow me to speak with them." The doorbell rang once more, this time with Wilder's voice shouting, "Security, step outside immediately." The authoritative tone was a clear imitation of police dramas he had seen on TV. Margold opened the door and moved onto the porch, preventing Wilder from entering our house by positioning herself squarely in the doorway. What transpired next still haunts my dreams. Wilder was at the base of our porch steps when, in a single fluid movement, he reached into his jacket and brandished a black handgun, a Glock 19. He aimed it straight at Marigold's face, his hand trembling noticeably with what could have been fear, adrenaline, or simply a lack of familiarity with firearms. "On the ground now," he yelled, trying to emulate police protocol he had likely seen on television. "You are under arrest for the assault of an officer." Behind him, Carl's face went pale, and Zania gasped, clearly not anticipating this turn of events. "Mr. Wilder," she stuttered, backing away several steps. "You mentioned nothing about a gun. This is not what you told me we were coming here for." Carl appeared as if he might faint, his gaze shifting between Wilder's weapon and Marigold, evidently regretting his choice to participate in this catastrophic mission. Marigold remained still. From the doorway, I watched in terror as my daughter evaluated the scene with a preternatural calmness. The distance between her and Wilder was roughly 12 feet. Carl and Zania were positioned to the right, about 5 feet behind Wilder. Wilder's quivering trigger finger was a significant cause for concern regarding an accidental discharge. She also took note of neighborhood onlookers across the street. The Hendersons were now plainly observing from their driveway and potential avenues of escape. This whole tactical analysis likely took less than 2 seconds, a skill she had been trained to perform automatically in situations that could be life-threatening. When she spoke, her voice possessed the gravity and authority that had established her as an outstanding trainer. "Mr. Wilder, you are in the process of committing a felony by aiming a firearm at me. Lower your weapon this instant." The command in her voice made even me want to comply. But Wilder was too engrossed in his power fantasy, too committed to his imagined authority to retreat now. "I am the law in this community," he yelled, saliva spraying from his mouth as the gun wavered precariously in his shaky hand. A clear indication to anyone trained in firearms that an accidental discharge was a genuine risk. What followed unfolded in what seemed like slow motion. Marigold started to speak calmly, employing hostage negotiation tactics as she almost imperceptibly shifted her weight forward. "I realize you feel disrespected, Mr. Wilder. Let's discuss this without the firearm. You don't want to make an error that will alter the course of your life." Her voice stayed even, almost like a conversation, intended to de-escalate rather than provoke. "Consider what will happen after you discharge that weapon. Is a parking spot worth a life sentence in prison?" She took one small step down, and then another. Her movements were so gradual that Wilder didn't appear to notice she was narrowing the gap between them. I could see his grip on the gun tightening, a sign of preparing to shoot that Marigold. with her specialized training, instantly recognized. In that instant, Marigold acted with the decisive quickness that had made her an elite military operative. She employed a disarming maneuver taught to SEAL operators, a swift blow to Wilder's wrist to divert the muzzle, while simultaneously twisting his arm and taking control of the firearm. The movement was practiced, effective, and performed at the precise moment Wilder's attention had briefly lapsed. The confrontation lasted about 8 seconds, not the smooth 3-second disarm often depicted in films, but a gripping real-world struggle with Wilder shouting and trying to keep his hold on the weapon. I heard Revina gasp from behind me, and across the street, Mrs. Henderson was already on her phone, likely calling 911. Once it was over, Marigold had Wilder face down on our lawn, his arms secured behind him in a restraining hold, with the Glock safely in her other hand, her finger correctly indexed away from the trigger guard, as any responsible gun handler would. Zania and Carl were frozen in shock as my daughter, still breathing heavily from the effort, directed me to contact the actual police. Inform them there has been an armed assault and the weapon is now secure, she stated with the same composure she might use to order coffee. Ensure they understand the situation is contained, but the suspect was armed and could still be a threat. I had already dialed 911, but I had no inkling that this was merely the start of our fight against the small empire that Wilder and Nancy had established in our neighborhood over the preceding 8 years. I could not have foreseen their ability to rally the entire local justice system against us, or that a minor parking disagreement would expose a network of corruption reaching far beyond our tranquil suburban community. Officer Rodriguez was on the scene shortly, discovering Marigold calmly holding Wilder on the lawn, encircled by violation slips and trampled rose bushes. She recounted the events with military clarity, how Wilder had menaced her with a lethal weapon following a disagreement over a parking infraction, and how she had been compelled to disarm him to ensure her own safety. I have secured the firearm and made it safe, she informed Rodriguez, who looked impressed by her composed state. The magazine has been taken out and the chamber is clear. I did not detect any other weapons on his person during the restraint. Rodriguez took detailed notes as Marigold outlined her background and training, which obviously gave her story credibility. Wilder was put in handcuffs and seated in the back of the patrol car, continuing to shout threats and assert his authority as HOA security, insisting that Officer Rodriguez acknowledge his jurisdiction in the area. We will require statements from every witness, Rodriguez informed us, gesturing toward the neighbors who had congregated to observe the incident. This is a grave matter. His partner was already speaking with Carl and Zania, both of whom appeared rattled. Carl was wringing his hands and glancing nervously at Wilder in the police car, while Zania was speaking with animation, clearly disassociating herself from Wilder's behavior. I felt a surge of relief, trusting that the system would function as intended. That sense of relief was fleeting. Not even 2 hours later, as we were still providing our statements at the local police station, the mood abruptly shifted. Officers who had been professional and attentive started to exchange glances and speak in hushed tones. Then I understood why. Nancy Weber had come in with Police Chief Thompson. They walked into the station as if they were in charge, Nancy in her pristine business suit and pearl necklace, Thompson with his chest puffed out in a show of importance. I recognized their connection from community functions. Nancy's husband, James, was Thompson's golf partner, and the HOA frequently made donations to the police fund, ostensibly for community safety projects that never seemed to come to fruition. It appears there has been a misunderstanding, Chief Thompson declared, looking over the documents with a cursory glance. His dismissive manner made it evident he had already made up his mind without considering any of the evidence. Mr. Wilder was carrying out his community safety responsibilities when he was assaulted. I watched, stunned, as Wilder was released from his handcuffs and his gun was given back to him, with Thompson patting him on the shoulder like an old acquaintance. But he aimed a loaded weapon at my daughter over a parking spot. I objected, feeling my anger rise. There are numerous witnesses. Thompson gave me a cold look, the kind that served as a stark reminder of who was in power in this town. According to Mr. Wilder, he only brandished his weapon after feeling endangered by your daughter, who he asserts has military combat experience. It's her account against his, and without definitive proof. He let the sentence trail off, purposefully disregarding the fact that neighbors had seen the entire event. Nancy Weber stood next to him, a look of satisfaction on her face that made me want to hurl something. That night, We found out that an emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled for the next evening. A sympathetic neighbor on the landscaping committee provided us with a copy of the agenda: vote to evict the Storm family for breaching community safety protocols and attacking security personnel. The paper was filled with provocative phrasing that depicted Marigold as dangerously erratic and a menace to the community's safety. Marigold remained calm. She instead contacted Michael Chan, a friend from college who was now a civil rights lawyer specializing in cases of HOA overreach. "This is no longer just about parking," she said to him, walking back and forth in our living room with a phone pressed to her ear. "There is a larger issue at play here. They are using the HOA as a personal fiefdom, and they have the police chief on their side." When Michael showed up the following day, looking sharp in his well-fitted suit and holding a briefcase filled with legal papers, we observed our neighbors averting their gaze and rushing indoors upon seeing us. The fear was tangible. Everyone was aware of what befell those who challenged Wilder and Nancy. The Patels had their garden wrecked after they complained about arbitrary rule modifications. The Gonzalezes were subjected to weekly inspections for months after they disputed a special assessment charge. Fear was a tool that had been carefully honed over many years. Marigold and Michael uncovered Wilder's criminal past, which included a sealed assault charge and ties to the police chief. The pattern was becoming evident. Wilder had a violent history that Thompson had helped to keep hidden. Even more troubling was their discovery about former residents who had opposed the HOA. An elderly couple, the Rosenbergs, had been compelled to sell their house at a considerable loss due to constant harassment and increasing fines for infractions that no one else was ticketed for, only to have the property bought by Nancy's brother for less than its market value and sold for a large profit a few months later. This wasn't merely petty despotism. It was a real estate racket disguised as community management. Our mailbox began to fill with violation notices: $500 for incorrect lawn care. Our grass was a quarter of an inch too high, according to Wilder's specially calibrated measuring device. $1,000 for unapproved external alterations, a security camera Marigold had put up after the incident with Wilder's gun, and finally, a $10,000 penalty for causing a community disturbance, accompanied by a threat of legal action that could seek much more. HOA inspectors, who were really just Wilder's associates, started to patrol outside our house around the clock, taking pictures and documenting every move. Our water was cut off for a short time for maintenance that strangely only impacted our residents, and we got notifications that our electricity could be next because of unspecified safety issues. "They are trying to force us out," Marigold noted as we sat in our dim living room that evening, using flashlights because our porch lights had inexplicably stopped working after an unannounced electrical check. "But they have no idea who they are up against. Every threatening communication, every act of illegal monitoring, is simply another piece of evidence I am gathering." She leaned in, her face lit by the flashlight's glow, and I saw the resolute expression that had enabled her to endure 12 years in some of the most perilous places on the planet. "And I've just found something explosive about how Wilder and Nancy have been embezzling HOA funds for years. Some of that money has gone directly into Police Chief Thompson's pocket. They've established a flawless little corrupt system. But systems have vulnerabilities, and identifying those vulnerabilities is precisely what I was trained to teach SEALs." The conflict intensified as Marigold meticulously recorded the infractions while Wilder persisted with his campaign of intimidation. His patrol vehicle would be parked in front of our house at night, its headlights aimed straight into our bedrooms, the engine revving intermittently to disturb our sleep. He would trail Ravina on her trips to the grocery store, maintaining a distance just close enough to be menacing without technically violating any laws. Bizarre inspections were carried out daily, sometimes several times, for increasingly ludicrous breaches. The angle of our mailbox was purportedly off by 2 degrees. The shade of white paint on our window frames did not precisely conform to the approved color scheme. The birds at our feeder were identified as non-native species and were consequently forbidden. One morning, we awoke to find our garden in ruins. Plants were torn from the ground, ornaments were broken, and even the small bench Ravina used while tending to her flowers had been smashed to bits. This act of vandalism was followed an hour later by a notice of violation for unsightly yard conditions, accompanied by another $1,000 fine. The psychological strain was starting to affect my wife, who was now struggling to sleep and would startle at every noise from outside. But Mara Gold stayed resolute, her military background having prepared her for this exact type of prolonged pressure campaign. Mara Gold had installed discrete surveillance cameras, which captured proof of Wilder's harassment, including footage of him tampering with our sprinkler system by methodically opening each control valve just enough to create a slow leak that would inflate our water bill. I'm tracing the money. Mara Gold and Michael collaborated with Rebecca Torres, a previous HOA treasurer who had collected evidence of the association's financial misconduct. These records exposed a startling pattern of monetary misuse that extended far beyond simple power abuses. The HOA brought in over $600,000 each year from the residents of Sunny Pines. However, a significant portion of this money was being rerouted through an intricate network of deceptive payments, $75,000 per year for security services, which was essentially Wilder's personal salary for bothering residents, $120,000 for management consulting paid to a shell corporation owned by Nancy that provided no actual services, and a variety of overpriced maintenance agreements with businesses owned by their friends and relatives, which billed 3 times the standard rate for mediocre work. The most alarming discovery was a recurring payment designated as a Community Safety Fund contribution that was funneled directly into a campaign fund for Police Chief Thompson. These were cleverly presented as lawful donations, but were clearly hush money for ignoring their actions. They have embezzled more than $250,000 from the community over the last 5 years, Michael stated after examining the paperwork, letting out a low whistle. This is no longer just an HOA matter. This is a criminal conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, and likely tax evasion as well. Mara Gold set up confidential gatherings with unhappy residents at Michael's house, which was outside the neighborhood, to evade being watched. Slowly, individuals started to open up about their experiences. The Martinezes had been penalized because their children were deemed too loud while playing in their own yard. Mrs. Johnson had been threatened with legal action because her son, who has autism, occasionally strayed into other people's yards. The Levines had endured constant harassment after they questioned why the community pool's renovation was repeatedly postponed, despite rising fees. They found out that Wilder had been regularly entering residents' backyards and even their homes when they were not there, an unlawful act that was recorded by several home security systems but was never reported for fear of reprisal. Even more troublingly, they discovered emails between Nancy and Wilder in which they discussed tactics to clean up the neighborhood by driving out undesirable families through focused harassment and biased enforcement of regulations. A euphemism for ousting elderly residents, families with children, and minorities who did not align with their idea of an exclusive community. They've set up a perfect system, George Williams articulated during one of these meetings, his voice resonating with the authority of his many years as a judge. The 70-year-old retired federal judge had been painstakingly gathering every HOA email and set of meeting minutes for the past 10 years as a personal project, motivated by a lifelong dedication to justice. Nancy establishes the rules. Wilder applies them to the people they want to get rid of. And Police Chief Thompson makes sure that no complaints ever go anywhere. In the meantime, they are all enriching themselves with our HOA dues while the property values of anyone they target decrease, enabling their associates to purchase properties at a low price and sell them for a high one. He laid out a comprehensive timeline he had put together, demonstrating how more than 24 families had been driven out through the same method of harassment, with their properties subsequently being bought by a small group of investors linked to Nancy. As the proof grew, Michael constructed a thorough legal argument and got in touch with the FBI about Chief Thompson's corruption. This is more than just HOA misconduct, he said to Mara Gold during a planning session in our kitchen. This is a systemic corruption of local government. We have enough here to initiate a federal inquiry. The turning point arrived when Wilder and Nancy initiated a lawsuit against Mara Gold for defamation and disorderly conduct, seeking $500,000 in damages and our prompt eviction from Sunny Pines. The lawsuit was rife with blatant falsehoods, asserting that Mara Gold had made threats against Wilder's life, that she was operating an illegal enterprise from her residence, and that she constituted a clear and immediate threat to the community. They believe they have me cornered with this lawsuit, Mara Gold commented as she looked over the legal documents spread out on our dining room table. Her expression was not one of worry, but of calculation. But a seal doesn't counterattack when trapped. We always have a plan already underway. This is no longer just about a car parked in the wrong spot. It's about revealing a corrupt system that has been in place for far too long. And tomorrow's HOA meeting will be the launch of Operation Exposure. The community center was filled to capacity for the HOA meeting, with a palpable tension hanging in the air. Nancy had declared attendance compulsory, threatening penalties for non-attendance, thus guaranteeing a captive audience for what she evidently anticipated would be our public shaming. Wilder was positioned by the entrance in his complete security attire, featuring a new badge that bore a suspicious resemblance to genuine police credentials, purposefully barring entry to several residents known to be sympathetic to us. I observed as he denied entry to the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had conferred with Marigold earlier that week, asserting that the meeting was full, a blatant falsehood, considering the vacant seats at the rear of the room. Nancy initiated the meeting with a smug self-assurance that made me furious, striking her gavel with more force than was necessary. Today, we will be voting on the expulsion of the Storm family from our community, she declared without any introduction, omitting the customary approval of minutes from the last meeting. Their hazardous and disruptive conduct will not be permitted in our tranquil neighborhood. As you are all aware, their daughter physically attacked our security officer and has been disseminating vicious falsehoods about our association's management. She then went on to depict Marigold as a violent military figure who was a danger to the community's safety, asserting that the parking dispute was merely the most recent event in a history of rule-breaking that jeopardized property values and community norms. The description was so wildly inaccurate that I had to ball my fists to prevent myself from shouting out. Throughout this defamatory speech, Marigold remained seated calmly in the front row, attired professionally in a blazer and trousers, with flawless posture and an inscrutable expression. She had made a point of coming early to claim front row seats, placing herself directly in Nancy's view, a psychological maneuver that clearly unsettled the HOA president, who repeatedly lost her place in her scripted speech. When Nancy finally paused to catch her breath after a particularly harsh accusation about Marigold's unstable tendencies, my daughter deliberately and slowly raised her hand. Before the vote is taken, I wish to assert my right to address these accusations, as stipulated in Section 7 of the HOA bylaws concerning due process in disciplinary matters. Her voice was serene but projected to every part of the room with no apparent strain, the same voice that could command respect on a chaotic battlefield. Nancy wavered, evidently surprised that Marigold was so well-versed in the regulations. "We don't really have the time for," she started to say. But George Williams rose from the back of the room, his towering stature and silver hair giving him an innate air of authority. "Point of order," he announced in the commanding judicial voice that had once directed federal court proceedings. "The bylaws explicitly grant any resident subject to punitive measures the right to speak to the community before a vote is held. This has been the regulation since 1992, when the association was founded. It is located on page 17, paragraph 4 of the governing documents." A wave of murmurs swept through the room as Nancy, her face flushed with barely contained rage, reluctantly gave up the floor. Marigold connected her laptop to the projector and launched into a meticulously crafted presentation, the culmination of weeks of inquiry. "This is not about a parking infraction," she stated, her voice calm and factual. "It is about the systematic misuse of authority and financial deceit that has harmed every homeowner present." She projected spreadsheets displaying the HOA's financial statements, emphasizing the questionable payments made to Wilder, Nancy, and their partners. The figures on the screen were color-coded and annotated, rendering the irregularities undeniable, even to those without a background in finance. "Your yearly dues of $3,000 per household are not funding community enhancements," she clarified, advancing to a pie chart that illustrated the true distribution of the funds. "They are being funneled into the pockets of the individuals who manage this HOA through overpriced contracts, fictitious security services, and consulting fees for services that are never rendered." Nancy made several attempts to interrupt, her face turning increasingly red, but the residents yelled for her to be quiet, captivated by the financial disclosures. Many were capturing images of the slides with their phones, preserving the proof. Wilder started to advance toward Marigold with a clear intent to intimidate, his hand moving toward the spot where his firearm would typically be. However, several larger men from the community, including Mr. Patel and Mr. Gonzalez, who had both endured years of persecution, moved to block his path, creating a silent human shield between him and the presentation. Just as Nancy was about to use her phone, likely to summon Chief Thompson for support, the community center door opened with a dramatic flare that could not have been more perfectly timed. Police Chief Anderson from the adjacent county came in, with a serious-looking woman in a suit, who instantly took charge. Nancy Weber and Nero Wilder, the woman declared, her voice resonating with official authority. I am Special Agent Carter of the FBI. We are conducting an investigation into claims of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption associated with the management of the Sunny Pines Homeowners Association, as well as potential criminal conspiracy involving local law enforcement. The room broke out in gasps and hushed conversations as the color drained from Nancy's face, her carefully constructed composure visibly collapsing. She tried to end the meeting, striking her gavel frantically, but the residents would not leave, blocking the exits and clamoring for explanations. What came next was a series of disclosures that played out like the concluding scene of a legal drama. Rebecca Torres came forward with the original financial papers, revealing years of deceptive dealings. Her hands were unsteady, but her voice was firm as she described how she had been intimidated into silence when she initially found the irregularities. They threatened to ruin my catering business if I said anything, she recounted to the shocked attendees. I was terrified, but I couldn't allow it to persist. Mara Gold showed videos of Wilder trespassing on private land and waving his unlicensed gun. The high-quality video clearly captured his face as he crept through backyards and peered into windows. Michael showed proof of how Nancy and Wilder had systematically intimidated and driven out many families over the years, linking their departures to subsequent below-market property sales to Nancy's connections. One after another, residents rose to recount their own stories of intimidation and fear, drawing strength from their numbers and the presence of law enforcement officials who were not under Thompson's control. Mrs. Gonzalez explained how she was fined $2,000 because her Christmas decorations remained up one day too long after her husband was admitted to the hospital with a heart attack. Mr. Patel disclosed how Wilder had threatened to report his home-based software consulting business to immigration services if he complained about arbitrary rule changes that appeared to be aimed at families of South Asian origin. The Johnsons, who had slipped in through a back entrance after being denied entry, described how their wheelchair ramp had been judged architecturally incompatible and was removed while they were away, leaving their daughter, who uses a wheelchair, unable to get into her own home without assistance. As Chief Anderson declared Wilder's arrest on numerous charges, including unlicensed firearm possession, criminal threatening, trespassing, and impersonating a law enforcement officer, I saw the dawning comprehension on Wilder's face. The veneer of authority dissolved, revealing the expression of a petty man watching his imaginary kingdom fall apart. How could this have occurred? How could a single woman have toppled his entire power base? Nancy tried to exit but was stopped by Agent Carter on charges of embezzlement and fraud. As the handcuffs were fastened around Wilder's wrists, I saw a look of pure bewilderment in his eyes. He was likely questioning how his domain had so thoroughly collapsed. But the tale was not yet finished. I still had one last card to play, one that would alter the operation of HOAs across the nation. The repercussions unfolded in the subsequent months, like a tidal wave of justice that swept not only through our community but across the entire region. Wilder was confronted with multiple felony charges: possession of an unlicensed firearm, assault with a deadly weapon, trespassing, impersonating a law enforcement officer, extortion, and a host of other counts that filled a full page of the indictment. The evidence against him was conclusive, reinforced by statements from dozens of residents who now felt secure enough to share their own accounts of intimidation and mistreatment. His tough guy persona disintegrated at the preliminary hearing, where he allegedly broke down in tears after being refused bail on the grounds of being a danger to the community, the exact term he had used to label Margold. Nancy Weber was charged with embezzlement, fraud, bribery, and extortion, her meticulously built reputation as a community leader now in ruins. The forensic examination showed that she had personally funneled over $300,000 of HOA money into her private accounts, masked as consulting fees and service agreements. Police Chief Thompson was put on administrative leave while an investigation into corruption and abuse of power was conducted. his career shattered by proof that he had taken bribes to overlook complaints about Wilder and to apply laws selectively to advance Nancy's real estate scheme. The story gained statewide attention, leading to inquiries into many other HOAs that exhibited similar patterns of misconduct. Journalists found that the situation in Sunny Pines was not an anomaly, but part of a wider trend of HOA corruption nationwide. Our community organized an emergency election to select a new HOA board with stringent transparency rules and mechanisms to check power. The bylaws were entirely overhauled to mandate financial audits, term limits, and resident supervision of all decisions. Jennifer Lopez, a 42-year-old resident with experience in community management and law, was chosen as the new president. Her initial move was to cut HOA fees by 40%, getting rid of all the overpriced contracts and pointless security costs while still ensuring adequate funds for the community's proper upkeep. We are going to demonstrate that an HOA can genuinely benefit its residents, not dominate them, she declared at her first meeting, to loud applause. Zania Ramirez went up to Mar Gold at this meeting, her usual professional composure briefly gone. "I need to apologize to you," she said, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. Wilder claimed there was a dangerous intruder menacing the neighborhood. "I had no idea he was referring to you or that he would draw a gun. I should have challenged him more, used my professional knowledge to see his manipulation." This marked the start of a friendship that would be crucial in the following months, as Zania's psychological expertise helped many residents cope with the trauma of living under the rule of Wilder and Nancy. The legal repercussions were swift and severe once the complete scope of the corruption came to light. Wilder agreed to a plea bargain for 5 years in prison plus restitution, dodging a possible 20-year sentence only by consenting to testify against Thompson and reveal the details of the entire operation. Nancy was sentenced to 3 years and was compelled to return all the stolen funds to the community, her carefully amassed fortune confiscated as the proceeds of criminal acts. Thompson resigned in shame before he could be indicted on federal corruption charges. Families who had been coerced into selling their properties for less than market value were compensated for their losses from the confiscated funds, a small form of justice for those who had lost their homes and community. But the most important change was initiated by Mar Gold herself. 6 weeks after the pivotal HOA meeting, she convened the community once more to play her final card. She had been collaborating with Michael to create a nonprofit organization named Community Shield. The idea had come to her during the restless nights when Wilder's intimidation was at its worst, stemming from the understanding that our experience was shared by thousands of others across the nation who lacked the means to resist. "What took place in Sunny Pines is not an isolated event," she stated to the assembled residents and media representatives who had come to report on the aftermath of the scandal. HOA misconduct occurs all over the country, with few options for victims who do not have a family member with military training and legal contacts. Community Shield will offer free legal advice to those dealing with HOA intimidation, teach residents how to document and oppose abuses of power, and push for legislative reforms to HOA laws. Drawing on her military background, Mar Gold created a detailed set of community defense tactics to assist people in defending their rights without resorting to violence. These included comprehensive instructions on how to properly document harassment, build neighborhood support systems, and effectively use the legal system. She developed online training programs for community leaders, instructing them on how to spot patterns of abuse and compile cases against corrupt board members. The organization quickly gained national recognition, with similar cases pouring in from all over the country. In its first year, Community Shield helped dozens of communities stand up to abusive HOAs, leading to the removal of corrupt board members and the recovery of embezzled funds in more than 30 cases across the nation. Sunny Pines was transformed into a showcase of effective HOA governance, with clear rules and balanced power structures that other communities started to adopt. This storm standard, as it became known in property management circles, included mandatory financial audits, term limits for board members, and a resident-led oversight committee with genuine authority to curb abuses. Our community served as a model of good governance, with professionals from all over the country coming to study how to enact similar changes. When Mar Gold was not instructing SEAL candidates, she journeyed across the country, conducting workshops on community empowerment and how to resist institutional bullying, using our experience as a blueprint for positive change. A documentary filmmaker started to record the Sunny Pines story as part of a broader look at HOA abuse in America, casting a national spotlight on an issue that had been festering in suburban areas for years. On the first anniversary of the confrontation, Our community hosted a celebration in the same center where Operation Exposure had taken place. The area had been completely transformed. Fresh paint, new furniture, and a wall displaying photos of community gatherings and volunteer efforts that had thrived under the new leadership. Residents who had once been too scared to look each other in the eye now openly discussed the bad old days, under the rule of Wilder and Nancy, recounting tales of perseverance and a renewed sense of community. Children played without the fear of being penalized for making noise, and elderly residents could relax in the common areas without worrying about arbitrary regulations. As Margold spoke to the crowd, I was filled with immense pride for what my daughter had achieved. Sometimes the most formidable adversaries are not foreign countries or terrorist groups like the ones I dealt with in the military, she said to the audience. Her voice infused with the wisdom gained from both her military career and this unforeseen civilian conflict. They are the small-time despots right here in our own neighborhoods. And the most crucial lesson I took from 12 years of training SEALs was not how to defeat an opponent, but how to foster a community so resilient that individuals like Wilder never get the chance to gain power in the first place. The car that was parked incorrectly became the catalyst for a nationwide effort to reform HOAs. And if you are dealing with a Wilder in your own HOA, keep in mind that real power does not originate from a weapon or a counterfeit badge. It originates from communities that are united by a shared goal. The audience broke into applause, many wiping away tears as they gave her a standing ovation. Margold had become a local hero of sorts, but more significantly, she had been instrumental in turning a divided neighborhood into a genuine community. After the presentations, as everyone mingled and enjoyed refreshments, I saw her engaged in a deep discussion with a group of residents who were establishing a community garden in an area that had previously been purely for show. She appeared truly at ease, not just as my daughter on a visit to her parents, but as someone who had discovered a new purpose as vital as her military career. As we headed home that evening, Margold smiled at the new community sign at the entrance to Sunny Pines. The old metal sign with its list of rules had been taken down and replaced with a simple wooden one that said, "Welcome to Sunny Pines, a community that stands together." In the warm glow of the setting sun, the words seemed to radiate with promise. "You know, Dad," she remarked with a thoughtful expression, "I've dedicated my career to teaching SEALs how to survive in dangerous situations. I never imagined I'd apply those same skills in a suburban setting." I chuckled, feeling more at ease than I had in months. Life has a funny way of surprising us. When you parked that Jeep, who could have foreseen where it would all go? Margold nodded, her face pensive. That's the nature of pivotal moments. You seldom see them for what they are when they're happening. Sometimes, I still find it hard to believe that one wrongly parked Jeep resulted in all of this. She gestured toward the neighborhood, where people were out for walks, conversing with neighbors, and children were playing freely on the lawns. But then I recall what I always say to my trainees: the most minor acts can initiate the greatest transformations when the moment is right. Those words have remained with me. What started as a simple visit from my daughter ignited a change that is still spreading to communities all over the country. Community Shield now has a presence in 42 states, with an expanding group of volunteer lawyers, former HOA board members dedicated to reform, and regular citizens who are determined not to let power-hungry individuals take over their neighborhoods. Margold now divides her time between her military responsibilities and conducting workshops on community empowerment, having discovered a way to serve her country on two separate but equally significant fronts.